Why are you so excited about researching nitric oxide?
Well, I think it's certainly the future of medicine and healthcare. I've been involved in this field for about 25 years now. I got involved right after a Nobel Prize was awarded for its discovery, so we knew it was an important discovery in physiology or medicine. But there were so many unanswered questions 25 years ago, and that was really what allowed me to delve into this and really devote my entire adult and professional life to understanding, number one, how's this molecule produced in humans? What goes wrong in people that can't make it? What happens to people when they lose the ability to produce nitric oxide? And then really what drove me is how can we start to develop rational therapies for nitric oxide deficiency? How do we restore the production of this molecule in the human body? And so, fast forward 25 years now, we can answer all of those questions.
And so you talked about seeing somebody win a Nobel Prize for it. Like, what got you specifically involved in nitric oxide?
Well, it was Lou Ignarro, who's one of the three U.S. scientists that shared in the Nobel Prize. He came to LSU School of Medicine, I believe in 2000 or 2001, so a couple of years after he won the Nobel Prize. And he spoke before the student body and, I had a chance to go have dinner with him that night afterwards and ask a lot of questions. And then, there was a pharmacologist at LSU School of Medicine named Martin Feelish, who had been involved in the nitric oxide research for probably 10 or 15 years prior to that. So I went to work and he was my mentor and we learned, methods to detect nitric oxide. And then from there, I went to Boston University School of Medicine where we continued the research. And then Fred Murad, one of the other gentlemen who shared the Nobel Prize, was aware of the work we were doing in nitric oxide and, recruited me to join the faculty of UT Medical School in Houston. That was my, first kind of independent research position as a professor of molecular medicine. Then I just devoted my own research group to continuing the work around nitric oxide. And we were making a lot of discoveries. We were publishing 10, 12, 15 papers a year, and it really got us excited. It got the field excited. When I started in this field, I think there were 30,000 scientific publications on nitric oxide. Today, there's nearly 200, and may have already surpassed 200,000 scientific publications on nitric oxide. So the field exploded. It's the future of medicine. Every age-related chronic disease is associated with a loss of nitric oxide production. So your body cannot and will not heal without nitric oxide, and that's been our focus and mission because for me, I always believed that if we could figure out how to produce nitric oxide, restore nitric oxide production and signaling in the human body, it would change the world. It would transform healthcare and really get away from disease management and really for the first time talk about preventative medicine. How do we live long? How do we live long life free of disease? And that's where really the role nitric oxide is going to play.
I love it. So you talked about some of the side effects of having deficiency or not having enough nitric oxide. Could you talk about what it is as a compound? I mean, I think when people hear the word, they think of blood flow. I think of it in the fitness space as pre-workout, getting the blood flowing, getting the pump so that you're ready to work out effectively. And to, when you're having the quote unquote pump, it's you imagine just your body being filled with nitric oxide because the blood flow is kind of crazy. So talk a bit about it more in depth as to what it is, how it's produced, where it is in the body, etc.
Well, interestingly, it's a gas. And it's a gas it was first discovered to be produced in the lining of the blood vessel. So the thought is that, or the science tells us that when your blood vessels produce nitric oxide, it leads to dilation. So now we can increase blood vessel dilation. You can improve oxygen and nutrient delivery to every organ, tissue, and cell in the body. And so that was the basis for all these pre-workouts. And so there's an enzyme found in our endothelial cells. The endothelial cells line all blood vessels throughout the body. And this enzyme converts arginine to nitric oxide through a very complicated biochemical reaction. So early on, 25 years ago, a lot of these products were just giving you arginine with a lot of antioxidants and most of the time caffeine, right, in these pre-workouts because obviously caffeine is a very powerful ergogenic aid and, has less perceived exertion from a workout. And so the field was flooded and the market was flooded with these products. But the problem was the older you get, the less efficient this enzyme becomes at converting arginine to nitric oxide. So the older you get, really the body loses its ability to utilize L-arginine. So those types of product technologies are really useless in older patients with endothelial dysfunction. I think they still work moderately well in kind of young, well-trained athletes. But the issue was, a lot of these companies contacted me 20 years ago. And I said, look, you got to get the caffeine out of these products because caffeine's a vasoconstrictor, nitric oxide's a vasodilator. And every single one of these companies says, look, if we took caffeine out of these products, people wouldn't buy them anymore because the product doesn't work anymore. And I go, well, look, that's pretty revealing. So you don't have a nitric oxide product. You've got a caffeinated product. If you take caffeine out and the product doesn't work and people don't want to buy it, then it's not a nitric oxide effect they're feeling. It's a caffeine effect they're feeling. So that's really the basis of age-related nitric oxide deficiency is the enzyme nitric oxide synthase becomes dysfunctional and the body's no longer able to utilize arginine for the production of nitric oxide. And we call that endothelial dysfunction. So now we have to figure out how do we restore endothelial function and how do we provide the body a source of nitric oxide when it loses its ability to make it on its own.
And so what do you think are the key factors that can reduce somebody's nitric oxide in the body?
Well, look, it's the Western lifestyle. It's the standard American diet, which we call the SAD diet. And it's really everything that we do as industrialized nations. There's another pathway that was discovered about 25 years ago where we can use diet, the oral bacteria, and stomach acid production to fuel and compensate for a loss of endothelial nitric oxide production. So we have to get enough nitrate from our diet, which typically comes from green leafy vegetables. We have to have the right oral bacteria to metabolize these nutrients into nitric oxide. And we must have sufficient stomach acid production. So number one, the Western diet is really depleted in most nutrients. In fact, there's data showing that since the 1940s to the 1990s, there's a 78% in nutrient density of the food and vegetables grown in America. So number one, we're nutrient depleted. Number two, 2 out of 3 Americans wake up every morning and use mouthwash, killing the oral microbiome. We and others have published that if you use mouthwash, you kill the microbiome, your blood pressure goes up, you lose the protective benefits of exercise because you're disrupting the body's production of nitric oxide. Then the other major problem is antacids. Proton pump inhibitors, these drugs, 200 million prescriptions written every year for these drugs. And another, 35% of Americans use these drugs over the counter. You don't even have to have a prescription for them anymore. These are Prilosec, Prevacid, Nexium, Omeprazole, Pantoprazole. So these drugs completely shut down nitric oxide production. And now there's data showing that people who have been on these drugs for 3 to 5 years have 40% higher incidence of heart attack, stroke, and Alzheimer's. So these drugs are deadly because they're shutting down nitric oxide production. And then, most people don't exercise, they don't sweat, we're deficient in nutrients, we get a buildup of toxins, and people get sick. So it's not rocket science. We have a clear understanding of the etiology and the mechanism of every single age-related human disease out there. Now, the issue is how do we address it? How do we resolve it? And drug therapy is not the answer.
Given what you just said, that the standard American diet is impacting our ability to produce nitric oxide, given the lack of nutrients, and that's not eating proper foods, we're not exercising effectively. What are some of the shifts or lifestyle changes you would have somebody make right away to make sure that they are producing and optimizing their nitric oxide levels?
Well, you got to change your diet, and it's really simple. It's things we've known now for decades. It's a balanced diet in moderation, and then moderate physical exercise. We got to move, we got to burn calories. But I think people have to eliminate processed foods, and the problem in the American diet is sugar and refined carbohydrates. Sugar is a poison. It's a toxin. It's sticky. Glucose is like glue. And so when people overconsume sugar or carbohydrates that then metabolize into glucose in the body, that glucose is a very sticky molecule, and it sticks to proteins. It sticks to enzymes. It sticks to hemoglobin. And we can pick this up as hemoglobin A1C, and it's a measure of kind of long-term glucose control and risk factor for diabetes. But it sticks to other proteins, albumin, and it sticks to enzymes like nitric oxide synthase. And when glucose sticks and sugar sticks to proteins and enzymes, it completely inhibits their function because Enzymes and proteins have to be able to change their conformation, move, transfer electrons, and when you have too much sugar stuck to them, they lose their conformation. They're no longer able to perform their enzymatic functions. And so, consuming too much sugar, there's this growing fad of getting your nutrients in gummies and chews, which is basically just sugar and seed oil. We have to eliminate that. You have to get rid of gummies and chews in your diet. So I think it's limiting carbohydrates. I'm a big proponent of protein. I think the older we get, the more protein we need in our diet to prevent muscle loss, prevent bone loss. I'm not a big fan of these extreme diets, straight keto, straight vegan. I think we need our nutrients from a diverse sources, but again, good quality, high protein, good fats with very limited carbohydrates and the complete elimination of sugar. And I think that right there will transform people's body and transform their entire health. And then, 20, 30 minutes of exercise a day, that alone is, it's cost savings, and it's going to make you feel better and motivate you to continue doing what you're doing.
As far as exercise, we talk a lot about like strength training on the show. And obviously like strength training is a great way to get blood flow going. So is cardiovascular exercise. What modes of exercise would you say are the best? You talked about 20, 30 minutes a day. Like, what do you think is the most effective mode of exercise for optimizing nitric oxide production?
Well, the science is pretty diverse. And so, 20, 30 minutes of cardio has been shown to activate and stimulate nitric oxide production. What I do personally is a combination of both. I like this high intensity interval training, this high intensity short duration, because, a lot of people don't have time. And, I tell people all the time, if you wait till you have time to exercise, you'll never exercise. You have to make time. And people don't stop exercising because they get old. People get old because they stop exercising. So I like the combination of both. I think resistance training is extremely important because it helps reinforce muscles and bone and continues this remodeling of the bone to adapt to this, weight bearing on the bones. But I think cardio is extremely important too, because it keeps your blood vessels soft and compliant and flexible. And high intensity interval training does both. You're getting your heart rate up, you're increasing your breathing. And in most cases, there's some resistance to it, whether it's squats, whether it's push-ups or weight training. But I think a combination of both. And now we're finding that, 2 minutes of high intensity interval training may be sufficient to induce these adaptive changes we see in 20, 30 minutes of cardio or that. So you don't have an excuse anymore that you don't have time to do exercise, because everybody can find 2 minutes a day to, do some burpees or push-ups or squats for 2 minutes, get your heart rate up, start breathing, and get a little bit of resistance exercise in it.
And, we've talked the last few minutes about the importance of optimizing your diet and lifestyle in order to kind of improve nitric oxide production and make sure that it's helping you in the aging process and improving your overall health. We cover stress on the show a lot. And if you're stressed chronically, obviously it can raise your blood pressure and it can lead to a lot of health issues. What's the relationship between stress and nitric oxide?
Yeah, look, the stress response, the activation of the sympathetic nervous system, this chronic fight or flight, increased cortisol levels, all that decreases nitric oxide production chronically, because what it does is it basically, in a fight or flight type mentality, you're decreasing blood flow to the organs, you're increasing blood flow to, your skeletal muscles, increasing your heart rate. And doing this chronically basically depletes all your body and this ability to produce nitric oxide and get endothelial dysfunction. So we have to manage stress. We live in a stressful time, but, it's not what happens to you that defines you. It's how you react to what happens to you that defines you. So, I made a conscious decision years ago that I don't get stressed. I don't worry about things that I can't control. And when you think about this and you realize how little you control in your daily life, then you don't worry, because worrying is not going to change the situation. Worry is going to make you sicker. It's going to make the situation seem worse. And so I wake up every morning with a servant's heart and gratitude, and I just go through the day and, I make the best decisions that I think for me, and I don't worry about the outside influences and things I can't control. But that's a very conscious and deliberate decision that everybody has to make. I live in a very stressful environment, but I don't let the stress affect me. We have to be able to appropriately manage stress, or else it's going to take its toll on us and it's going to affect our health.
I think the stress is definitely, in my opinion, like something you have to get under control because it leads to so many negative health outcomes if you don't manage it properly. And I think one of the things is when you're not managing your stress effectively, your sleep is off. A lot of talk about sleep over the recent years, a lot of talk about getting quality sleep. Talk about the relationship between sleep and nitric oxide.
Well, sleep is probably the single most important thing that affects our health because it's during sleep that we repair, right? We repair and replace dysfunctional cells, and all that's dependent upon the body's ability to make nitric oxide, because nitric oxide is the signal that tells our own stem cells to mobilize, differentiate, repair, and replace dysfunctional cells, and all that occurs during sleep. But if we're stressed, we're not getting 6, 8 hours of good sleep a night, then our body is unable to repair, and we develop these senescent cells, dysfunctional cells, and it gets us sick. But during that sleep, we have to have adequate oxygen because oxygen is required to make nitric oxide. If you have obstructive sleep apnea or you're a mouth breather, your body becomes deficient in oxygen, becomes deficient in nitric oxide, and you wear yourself out and you're not able to repair and replace. So you have to get adequate sleep. And it's during that sleep, and if you're doing nasal breathing, you're fully oxygenated, your body's producing nitric oxide, you're mobilizing stem cells, you're balancing your autonomic nervous system, you're going into that rest and digest parasympathetic phase and kind of shutting down the sympathetic response. And that's the normal kind of sleep response and how we heal. But if you're not sleeping, if you have sleep apnea, you're over time, it's going to catch up with you and you're going to get sick and you're going to have an early death.
You've talked about like health and longevity as it relates to nitric oxide. Like, what does the top level current research say about nitric oxide's like role in aging, longevity, etc.?
What I look at is the literature and how do we measure longevity? What are the key hallmarks of living longer? And there's really three main tenets of that. There's telomeres, the ends of our chromosomes, that shorter telomeres, shorter lifespan. There's mitochondria. Every age-related chronic disease is associated with lower numbers of mitochondria per cell. And then those mitochondria become dysfunctional. And then the third is stem cells. The ability to mobilize our stem cells to repair and replace tissue. So aging is just the inability to repair and replace dysfunctional cells. We're constantly wearing ourselves out, but if we can repair and replace by mobilizing stem cells, then we can extend, lifespan and improve our health span. And interestingly, nitric oxide controls all three of those. Nitric oxide activates the telomerase enzyme, prevents telomere shortening. Nitric oxide is what induces mitochondrial biogenesis in the cell and affects the efficiency of mitochondrial energy production. And then, as I mentioned, nitric oxide is what mobilizes stem cells to repair and replace tissue. So if your body can't make nitric oxide, you get shorter telomeres, shorter lifespan, mitochondrial dysfunction, you get sick, you become energy deficient, and you can't repair and replace dysfunctional cells. So if we can employ strategies to optimize nitric oxide, recapitulate production and signaling, now we can prevent telomere shortening. We can have more mitochondria generating more ATP more efficiently with less oxygen, and we mobilize our own stem cells. So that's really the holy grail in longevity and anti-aging medicine is nitric oxide. It's foundational for everything we know about longevity.
This is all, I guess, like backed up, would you say, by like peer-reviewed research?
Absolutely. So everything I say and report, it's cited and referenced in the published literature, and multiple reports corroborating those original observations. So the beauty of science is, you can have objective measures and collect data to make a point, and we can ask any question in biology and then design an experiment to answer that question. And that's what I love about the basic sciences, because it gives us complete intellectual freedom to ask any question we want to solve some unknown medical mystery and then design an experiment and get data to tell us what the answer is. And so all of this has been very well elucidated in the scientific literature, and most of it has been translated into clinical medicine. So it's really indisputable at this point.
And speaking of data and clarification and stuff, is there any like common misconceptions you see about nitric oxide on the internet or just through conversations you're having with people that you'd like to clarify?
Yeah, like there's still these people out there who are saying that nitric oxide is this free radical, this toxic, damaging molecule, and it should be avoided because it interrupts mitochondrial production and oxygen binding to cytochrome C oxidase, and it reacts with superoxide and forms peroxynitrite. And these people are just completely uninformed or misinformed. And these are people, and that's my problem with the biohacking world, right? You have these people who have no scientific background, no scientific credentials that are out there, with millions of followers, and there's these influencers, and they're given the wrong information, and it's dangerous. And so, these people need to be informed and set the record straight, because one of the antioxidant effects of nitric oxide is its ability to scavenge oxygen radicals like superoxide, like hydroxyl radical, and then neutralize it and form inorganic nitrite or nitrate from this, and alleviate oxidative stress. And then, nitric oxide binds to cytochrome C oxidase. It's a reversible binding, so it allows oxygen to diffuse further into tissue. So these people who are out there, talking bad about nitric oxide, saying it should be avoided, just don't understand the biochemistry and the physiology. And why would they? They don't have the education. They don't have the background to understand the basic biochemistry and enzymology of nitric oxide. So it's just ignorance. Ignorance is curable. Ignorance is just a lack of information. And I can deal with ignorance. What I can't deal with is stupidity. And stupidity is having the information in front of you and still, failing to recognize it and acknowledge it. And so stupidity is one of those things I can't deal with.
You talked about dark leafy greens and protein as being like really monumental for increasing your nitric oxide production. Are there any specific foods that, like, within those that you think if somebody were to just want to like get started right away and they want to start eating better, like what are some of the foods specifically that they should include?
On average, the darker the green leafy vegetable, typically the higher the nitrate content. So nitrate is one of these nutrients that's found in the soil. It's assimilated in the form of nitrates. So when vegetables grow, they assimilate this. Then when we consume them, we're getting a source of nitrate. But we published in 2015 that depending upon where those vegetables are grown, different parts of the U.S., the different types of farming practices, organic versus conventional, whether you add nitrogen-based fertilizers to the soil or not, can affect the nitrogen content or the nitrate content of the foods we eat. So there's as much as a 50 to 80-fold difference in the nitrate content of celery in New York versus Chicago, Los Angeles, or Dallas. So it's very difficult to make specific recommendations on which foods you should eat, because it depends on which vegetable you're eating and what part of the country you live in. But on average, I think it's still accurate to say that the darker the green leafy vegetable, typically the higher the nitrate content. And then for protein, we need, proteins are broken down into amino acids. Humans never are designed to assimilate foreign proteins, whether it's animal protein or plant protein, into the human protein machinery. So what happens is we consume these proteins. As long as we have sufficient stomach acid, we break down those proteins into amino acids. Then the human body uses those amino acids to make human proteins. So we need a source of protein that provides us all the essential amino acids plus the non-essential amino acids. And so that's why I think it's important to get, a high protein, good protein source, good fats, and then limited carbohydrates with a lot of antioxidants in our food from some green leafy vegetables.
From my own understanding, I've always heard like beets is like the quote unquote holy grail of nitrous oxide. I mean, you're seeing now even like beet powder for pre-workout. What are your thoughts on beets as a source of nitric oxide?
Yeah, no, look, beets became a hero vegetable back in 2012 when it was realized that during the 2012 London Olympic Games, and there was some evidence in the published literature that beetroot juice, which was concentrated in nitrate, could enhance exercise performance and basically enhance your performance in well-trained athletes. And a lot of times that's the difference between winning and losing. So then the market became saturated with beet products, and I've tested probably, if not all the beet products on there, the majority of them. And what we found was 95% of the beet powders and beet products on the market were completely devoid of any nitric oxide activity. There was no detectable nitrate, nitrite. And so all these beet products do is turn your pee and your poop pink and red and cause a lot of anxiety. But there's no nitric oxide benefit to them. In fact, we use these beet powders as placebos in our clinical trials because it's a great placebo. And so if you're looking at a nitric oxide effect of beets, you have to use a good placebo. So we use a lot of these commercial beet products as the placebo in our clinical trials. So beets are, number one, they're the third least liked vegetable in the world. They're messy. And 95% of the products on the market don't provide any nitric oxide benefit whatsoever. The other problem is you see these commercials for beet products, beets gummies, beet capsules, and you have to understand the math. So even the most concentrated beet products out there, about 5 to 9% inorganic nitrate. You can concentrate this based on the growing conditions and adding nitrogen-based fertilizers to the soil. So that means to get this 300 to 400 milligrams of nitrate that's required, that's necessary and sufficient to see a nitric oxide effect, you need about 3,500 to 6,000 milligrams of this concentrated beet powder. So understand 95% of the beet powders out there provide no nitrate, so you can eat the whole container. You're not going to get a nitric oxide effect. The other thing, in companies selling beet capsules, you would probably have to take 8 or 10 of those capsules or more to see a nitric oxide effect. And then the beets found in gummies, which is only about a gram, again, and not all of that is beet powder. So the math doesn't work. You cannot consume enough of these, even assuming they're the highest concentration beet powder out there in nitrate. So I tell people, beets are a fad. Number one, they contain oxalates. People that are susceptible to kidney stones can get into problems. And so they provide really no nitric oxide benefit. We understand this science. We created a product where we ferment the beets. We take out all the oxalates. We optimize the nitric oxide activity. We add electrolytes. We add mitochondrial ATP. And this product called NO-Beets is no doubt the best beet product out there. It doesn't look or taste like beets. It's a white powder, taking the beet pulp, the beet taste out, and it's a nitric oxide generating product. It's a great pre-workout or just an energy pick-me-up to hopefully replace all the dangerous stimulant energy products like Red Bulls, Monster, 5-Hour Energy, those dangerous energy drinks.
What do you think about like eating foods like watermelon that are high in arginine, which arginine is the precursor to nitrous oxide, right?
Well, watermelon contains a higher concentration of an amino acid called citrulline, L-citrulline. So citrulline is a byproduct of nitric oxide production. And that amino acid can be recycled through the partial urea cycle to arginine. And then arginine goes to make nitric oxide. You get citrulline as a byproduct. So you get this metabolic recycling or substrate recycling within the cell to produce nitric oxide. But the problem is we're never deficient in arginine or citrulline because these are semi-essential amino acids, meaning we get it from the breakdown of protein, but it's constantly produced through the urea cycle. So even in the sickest of patients, you've got intracellular concentrations of arginine of 100 to 200 micromolar, and you only need about 5 micromolar to saturate the binding site of the enzyme. So we already have 20 to 40 times more than what's necessary to bind to the enzyme that makes nitric oxide. So arginine and citrulline products are absolutely useless in terms of producing nitric oxide.
You hear a lot about libido as it relates to blood flow. Talk about the role of nitric oxide when it comes to like sex drive and like, I guess some of the dangers when it comes to that of being depleted of nitric oxide. And then what are some ways that people can optimize their hormones?
Well, when we look at, we touched on this briefly earlier. When you look at symptoms of nitric oxide deficiency, the first symptom to show up in people who can't make nitric oxide is sexual dysfunction. And this is in both men and women. And when you think about this, it makes perfect sense. So to get an erection, either a penile erection or a clitoral erection, you have to get engorgement. You have to get an increase in blood flow. And that increase in blood flow only comes from the production of nitric oxide to dilate the blood vessels to allow for that increase in blood flow and to get engorgement. And then in the penis, we get an increase in inflow, and then the outflow is restricted, and that's what causes an erection. But if you can't make nitric oxide, you don't get vasodilation, you don't get engorgement, and that's the definition of erectile dysfunction. And then in women, the anatomy is a little bit different, but the physiology is exactly the same. In order for women to have an orgasm, you got to get an increase in intralabial, intraclitoral pressure. That increase in pressure comes from an increase in blood flow. That increase in blood flow comes from the body's ability to produce nitric oxide. So if you can't produce nitric oxide, you don't get dilation in the labia, in the clitoris, you don't get blood flow, you don't get the increase in pressure, and women become anorgasmic. So it's the exact definition of sexual dysfunction. The interesting thing is that if you have endothelial dysfunction and you can't make nitric oxide in the blood vessels of the sex organs, that same dysfunction it's a systemic disease. You get that same disease in the coronary arteries and the cerebral arteries, in the arteries of the liver, the lungs, the kidneys. And if you can't produce nitric oxide in the lining of the blood vessels, you can't regulate blood flow upon demand. So when you start to exercise, you can't dilate the coronary arteries, you develop, fatigue and shortness of breath and changes in electrical activity, and that's diagnostic for ischemic heart disease. If you can't dilate the blood vessels of the brain when you want to recall memory, you develop dementia, mild cognitive disorders, and eventually Alzheimer's. So all of that ED and sexual dysfunction is the canary in the coal mine and tells us that you have systemic disease and nitric oxide deficiency that you have to correct. If not, you're going to have a heart attack, stroke, and Alzheimer's.
Are there any other habits or behaviors that you think are important as it relates to nitric oxide production that we haven't touched on yet?
We talk about, I tell people all the time, you only got to do two things to restore nitric oxide. Stop doing the things that disrupt it. Get rid of fluoride in your toothpaste. Get rid of fluoride in your drinking water. Stop using mouthwash. Stop using antacids. Those are the big three stops: fluoride, antacids, and mouthwash. And now you can stimulate the production of nitric oxide. Balanced diet in moderation, moderate physical exercise, and then really the third big one is sunlight. Certain wavelengths of light, full spectrum light, will stimulate and activate nitric oxide release. There's clear evidence people who live in the northern hemisphere, Scandinavians, for example, typically have higher blood pressure than people who live near the equator because of the effects of sunlight on nitric oxide production. And then in the winter, when there's limited sunlight, depending on where you live, I'm a big fan of infrared saunas, infrared light therapy, because that's been clearly shown to activate and stimulate nitric oxide release. So there's these photolabile stores that can be activated upon by certain wavelengths of light. And really, it's that simple. If you do those things, get rid of fluoride, get rid of mouthwash, stop using antacids, change your diet, exercise, and 20, 30 minutes of sunlight a day, you'll be amazed at how simple that is and how transformative it is on your just overall health.
This episode is brought to you by Beam Minerals. Ultimately, good health is about the basics. If you eat whole foods, exercise regularly, manage your stress and sleep, and make sure you have good relationships, you'll definitely be 90% of the way there. But as you get older, the basics can be hard to maintain, especially when it comes to nutrition. Nutrient needs can actually increase with age, and many of us don't meet them. And let's face it, there's so many people that are nutrient deficient, which is why it's so important to pay attention to your nutrient levels. The problem is that everything starts with nutrition, and if you aren't getting enough minerals, it will affect all the other fundamentals of health, including sleep, stress, your metabolism, and so on. That's why I've partnered with Beam Minerals. They make it easy to round out your diet with the full spectrum of minerals so that you can be sure all your bases are covered. All you do is take a shot of mineral-rich liquid each morning. It tastes like water and replenishes every essential mineral in the right ratios in just 30 seconds a day. I've worked with Beam to get a special discount code for my audience. So head to beamminerals.com. That's www.beamminerals.com and use promo code Doug at checkout for 20% off your order. Again, that's www.beamminerals.com and use the code Doug at checkout for 20% off. Now back to the show. Yeah, and I would think something to add there that I guess in my opinion is above all else is most important is like really taking care of your stress levels though, because I think if you don't manage your stress, I think your sex drive will naturally go down, your sleep will be off, you'll eat foods that aren't healthy, you won't want to exercise, your life will just be chaotic. I mean, would you say that like in the hierarchy of the stuff you just mentioned, do you think stress is above all else the most important?
Yeah, no doubt. Look, if you can't manage your stress, you're not going to sleep. You're not going to get fully oxygenated. You're going to lose the ability to produce nitric oxide. Now you're on this very slippery slope to the rapid onset and progression of chronic disease. And I think that's why, Personally, I have a very consistent routine. I wake up every morning at usually 5 or 5:30, and I go put on a pot of coffee. I only drink, 1.5 cups of coffee, and then I get in my infrared sauna, and I spend 30 minutes in a sauna at 170 degrees. I open up my Hallow app. I do my daily prayers, and I just focus. Number one, I reflect on the day before. How do I become better today than I was yesterday? There's this constant drive and motivation to be better than I was yesterday. But number two is I wake up and I go, how can I serve others? Wake up with a feeling of gratitude and servant's heart, and just plan my day. And don't let anything interrupt me. What do I need to accomplish? I make a mental note of what I got to accomplish today, what I'm going to do to accomplish that. And then I don't let any outside influences affect that. And yeah, everybody has unexpected things that stress occurs in their life. There's always disruptions in the plan, but I just roll with it. People have to make a conscious decision to handle their stress and to manage it, because there's no way to avoid, in the world we live in, there's no way to avoid stress. There are ways to manage the stress to where it's not going to affect your health. But yeah, I would agree with you. Stress is a huge factor. And if you can't handle stress, your relationships are going to suffer, your health is going to suffer, and it's a major problem.
Totally. And like, there's a lot of people that before making lifestyle changes, they go to supplements first. And I think, in my opinion, it's backwards. I think if you don't change your habits, you don't change your behaviors, like a supplement's not going to fix your problems. That said, I mean, I openly promote supplements on the podcast. I know you also, I think, have supplements. Without getting specific, without prescribing anything, like, what are some of the things that people should look for or pay attention to when buying supplements like this? Because I think there's so many out there, and I just don't want people to be misled.
No, look, I mean, most of the products on the market are inferior products. So you have to, pay attention. You got to look at the data. And if you look at the NHANES study, which is a study of the U.S. population of what kind of their nutrient deficiencies, 75% of Americans are deficient in magnesium. 95% of Americans are deficient in iodine. Another 80% are deficient in vitamin D. Like 65% are deficient in selenium, chromium, the basic micronutrients, trace minerals. But what I like to do is do personalized nutrition, do micronutrient analysis to figure out what exactly your body's missing. I mean, you can look at the data and kind of make educated, informed decisions on what your body may need, but there's nothing better than the precision medicine of micronutrient analysis of what is my body missing. Then let me supplement that and be efficient and not take things that your body's not going to be able to utilize, and you're just making expensive urine. But look, there are different forms of magnesium. Magnesium oxide. I mean, there's too much to go through in this podcast, but a lot of times most of the time, the cheapest products on the market are the ones that really have no bioavailability. So you're going to have to invest in your health. And sometimes these more superior supplements cost more because, number one, there's science behind them. Number two, they're probably putting it in a form that's bioavailable, so when you consume it, the cells actually take it up. But that's the big deal for me. You have to do research, look for companies who are science-based, who really provide certain nutrients. And I'm not aware of any one company that provides all the nutrients in the highest quality. So what I look for are companies who specialize. We make nitric oxide products. That's all we do because that's what we know. It doesn't say that there are other things. I take a glutathione product. We don't make a glutathione product because that's kind of not my niche. I don't know them. I don't make a magnesium product because there are other companies out there who specialize in that, who do the science, who do the research, who provide the best products. So you've got to pick and choose of the best companies who are providing the best product for that and have the science behind that particular product. But the challenge is you can find anything you're looking for on the internet, but you have to be able to kind of work through the noise and figure out which companies are real, which are backed by science, and which companies, spend a lot of money and have deceptive trade practices and, really good creative marketing, but really no science.
And I think people, when they're listening to this information, like, they're like, all right, well, Dr. Bryan, he specializes in nitric oxide. Of course, he's super passionate about this. All this stuff that he's sharing sounds great and very informative. but I'm somebody who maybe hasn't been putting my health first. I'm somebody that hasn't been including a lot of these habits in my current lifestyle. We've talked about a lot as far as shifts people can choose to make. If you're talking to the person that is following the standard American diet, they're not exercising a lot, they're just trying to figure out what's the one thing they can do to improve their health. Like, where does somebody start?
Yeah, look, we have to change the way that, medicine in the U.S. is a reactive practice. And people don't make changes until there's an event. And we only change habit based on fear. And usually that fear comes from having a heart attack, having a stroke, having some health crisis. And then they have that moment where they go, oh, now I need to do something. But I think we have to change the perspective and be proactive. Take steps before there's a health crisis, before fear becomes a motivating factor. But you have to, you didn't get to this space in one day. Don't expect to change it in one day. So I tell people is look, do the simple things and take one step at a time. Start to implement these things. So number one, if you're using mouthwash, just stop using mouthwash. That's very simple and it's cost saving. Number two, then do that change your diet. Eliminate processed foods, limit your sugar and carbohydrate intake, do a 16, 18-hour fast every day. Only eat between noon and 6. And then the data and the science on intermittent fasting and caloric restriction is really impressive. That right there, I guarantee you, I see people within 30 days completely transformed, just getting rid of mouthwash, get rid of fluoride, then just doing an 18-hour fast every day. Eat your last meal at 6 p.m. and then don't eat the next day till noon. And there's these adaptive effects that occur in the human body that completely change your metabolism and your metabolic flexibility. And you start to lose the hunger pains, you start to lose the sugar cravings, and then it's much easier. It's going to be hell for 48, 72 hours because you're going to feel like you're hungry and you need to eat, and because that's what your body's used to. But you've got to change that habit. But those three things right there will transform your health. Get rid of fluoride in your toothpaste. Stop using mouthwash. Do intermittent fasting. And when you do eat, just eat a lot of protein, good fats, and limit your carbohydrates.
I know you're super passionate about longevity right now. Like, what other shifts have you been making as you've aged to optimize your health and longevity?
Well, look, I have to be more diligent and intentful on what I do and how I spend my day. Because when we're young, we can get away with eating, a not so healthy diet. But the older we get, we really have to pay attention to it. But for me, it's, watching what I eat. High protein, low carb, and then, exercise. We have to move. And then, every morning after my sauna, I stretch. Because the older we get, our muscles become tight and then we're prone to injury and slower recovery. So staying fit, staying flexible by stretching, watching what we eat, and just being active. I mean, those are the things. And then basically detoxifying, limiting the source of toxins in our body. But, again, I'm on an airplane every week. I'm traveling all over the world, and I'm exposed to, different types of toxins. And so we have to detoxify. We got to sweat. We got to do deep breathing exercises, a good urination, good bowel movements. That's our body's detoxification mechanisms, and just watching what we put in our body and help detoxify. It's really that simple.
Anything else that we haven't covered that you think people should know when it comes to nitric oxide?
Yeah, I think the challenge we've been dealing with for the past 20 years is, in the supplement industry, it's the wild, wild west, right? You got all these companies out there selling nitric oxide that they can say the same thing I'm saying, because the Dietary Supplements Health and Education Act of 94, we call it the DSHEA Act, which kind of restricts what we can say in dietary supplements. But I think what we're doing is a little bit different. We've got a drug company called Bryan Therapeutics, and we're taking this technology through the FDA. And my objective for the past 25 years was to get safe and effective nitric oxide products in every major product category around the world. We've done this in nutrition. We've done it in dietary supplements. We've done it in skincare. Now the next frontier is drug therapy, to where physicians, if a patient goes to their doctor and they have, ischemic heart disease, or they have Alzheimer's, or they got an ulcer that won't heal, diabetic ulcer, then there should be nitric oxide drugs that they can prescribe to affect those indications and those conditions. So that's what we're doing. We're moving this technology through clinical trials for ischemic heart disease. We've got an Alzheimer's drug we're working on, and we make a topical drug for diabetic ulcers and non-healing wounds. 60,000 Americans die every year from wounds that become infected and they get septic. And to me, that's simply unacceptable because nitric oxide kills the infection in the wound, gets blood flow to the wound, and we haven't seen a wound or that we haven't been able to heal with our topical nitric oxide. And then in terms of Alzheimer's, which is undoubtedly the most feared disease of around the world, it's a symptom of nitric oxide deficiency. Because in Alzheimer's, you see a restriction or loss of regulation of blood flow. You develop insulin resistance. You can't get glucose into the cell. Proteins start misfolding, and you develop amyloid plaque and tau tangles. If we restore nitric oxide, we can improve cerebral blood flow. We can fully oxygenate, get the nutrients in, take out the waste products. We can potentiate insulin signaling, get glucose into the cell. And when you do that, there's no protein misfolding. You don't develop mild cognitive disorders. You eliminate the dementia, and you prevent the onset and progression of Alzheimer's. So nitric oxide, in my opinion, and I think the science corroborates this, will completely eradicate Alzheimer's disease.
My last question I had, I guess, around like cardiovascular health that I didn't bring up before is like, what would you say like the biggest role nitric oxide has with cardiovascular health, like blood flow and blood pressure? Like, how does it actually explain the process of how it goes from nitric oxide to then like influencing things like blood pressure in the heart?
Yeah, so nitric oxide is produced when we start to exercise. It causes a shear stress in the lining of the blood vessel. That shear stress activates nitric oxide synthase enzyme, so it produces nitric oxide. Then, as we mentioned, nitric oxide is a gas, so it diffuses in all three dimensions. Part of it diffuses into the lumen of the blood vessel, where it downregulates adhesion molecules, so you prevent the vascular inflammation. You don't get platelets activated. You don't get the monocytes and neutrophils sticking to the lining of the blood vessel. But part of that gas diffuses into this underlying smooth muscle, where it activates an enzyme called guanylyl cyclase, and that leads to a second messenger called cyclic GMP. And then cyclic GMP mobilizes calcium, leads to smooth muscle relaxation and vasodilation. And that's the mechanism of enhancing blood flow, oxygen, nutrient delivery to the working skeletal muscle or to the working heart muscle, or really every organ, tissue, and cell in the body. And this is where drugs like Viagra works, because the PD-5 inhibitors prevent the breakdown of this second messenger cyclic GMP. So nitric oxide turns this switch on, and the PD-5 inhibitors keep it on. So we now know that, people who use Viagra or Cialis have lower incidence of Alzheimer's. Those patients were actually protected from coronavirus during the COVID pandemic. So there are many reported results and benefits of improving circulation and blood flow, whether it's production of nitric oxide or potentiating nitric oxide signaling and vasodilation through PD-5 inhibitors. But all of the human disease, every human chronic disease has a vascular component. If you have kidney disease, you have reduced blood flow to the kidney. If you have neurological disease, you have decreased blood flow to the brain. If you have coronary disease, you have restricted blood flow to the coronary artery. So every major human chronic disease is determined by the ability of that organ to get blood flow, oxygen, nutrients to it, and all of that is dependent upon the blood vessel's ability to produce nitric oxide.
Last question I have for you is, imagine you meet somebody in a coffee shop, you got 2 minutes to give them the elevator pitch on nitric oxide. What are you saying to them?
Look, nitric oxide is foundational. Your body cannot and will not heal without nitric oxide production. So understand how your body is able to produce nitric oxide. What are you doing that may be inhibiting it? Because nitric oxide does 4 fundamental things that are essential for human optimization and human health. Number 1, it restores blood flow. We need adequate blood flow and oxygen delivered to every cell in the body. Number 2, it mitigates inflammation. As I mentioned, downregulates the adhesion molecules in the lining of the blood vessels. Some of my patents are on a method of reducing C-reactive proteins, so we reduce inflammation. Number 2, it inhibits oxidative stress. As I mentioned earlier, it scavenges oxygen radicals and neutralizes those. And then number 3, it prevents the immune dysfunction that we see in every major chronic disease. So every major chronic disease, low blood flow, inflammation, oxidative stress, and immune dysfunction, nitric oxide addresses all 4 of those. So it's foundational. It's not an end-all, be-all, cure-all. It's not a silver bullet, but your body cannot and will not heal without nitric oxide. Focus on restoration of nitric oxide production and signaling in the human body, and then everything else will work better.
Dr. Bryan, thank you so much for your time. If people want to learn more about your work, where's the best place to do that?
I have a dedicated YouTube channel where we'll post informative interviews like this and lectures. It's Dr. Nathan S. Bryan, Nitric Oxide on YouTube. I'm on Instagram, Dr. Nathan S. Bryan. The same handle on LinkedIn. I'm on Twitter, Dr. Nitric. And then I've got an educational website, drnathansbryan.com. I do a monthly blog there. We've got informative videos about nitric oxide. Find me on PubMed. I've got a couple of books. I've got a new book coming out this winter called The Secret of Nitric Oxide, Bringing Nitric Oxide to Life. So be on the lookout for that.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much again for your time. I think the audience could get a lot of value out of this.
Thank you, Doug. Appreciate you.
Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, I really think you're going to like this video as well. I'll see you there.